The first thing I noticed was that they were laughing. Not nervous laughter. Not the kind that species produce when fear finds no other exit. Real laughter. Loud, open-throated, head-tilting laughter. And they were doing it 300 meters from an active front line where the Varrox Dominion had been reducing coalition positions to dust for the past 11 days. I pressed my recording device against my chest and stood very still, because I did not know what else to do. My name is Veth Karn. I am a correspondent for the Savari Interplanetary Dispatch, and I had spent 14 years covering conflicts across 6-star systems. I had seen Karathi siege formations. I had watched the Ulvith Mercenary Corps dismantle a moon garrison in under 2 hours. I had filed reports from places so dangerous that my editor had cried when I returned alive. Nothing in any of that had prepared me for forward operating base Ura. The transport that dropped me had barely touched the landing pad before the ramp opened. The air hit me first, thick with something burned, something chemical, something I later learned was called gun oil and coffee, and that the humans considered both of these to be essential supplies. Then the noise hit. The base was not quiet in the way military installations were supposed to be quiet. There was shouting, but it was conversational shouting. There was machinery grinding somewhere to my left. There was music, actual music, being played from a speaker that had been lashed to a fuel container with a strip of something orange and rubbery. A human walked past me dragging a crate that looked twice his body weight. He did not look at me. He was whistling. I had been told that the human volunteers were brave. I had been told they were aggressive. I had been told they were willing to absorb casualties that would have broken any other species' formations in the first engagement. What I had not been told was that they were so relentlessly, almost aggressively, normal about all of it. The Coalition had embedded me here as part of a documentation initiative. The official reasoning was public. The Galactic Coalition wanted a record of allied species' contributions to the war effort. The unofficial reasoning, which my editor had explained to me over a very long drink the night before I shipped out, was simpler. Nobody expected the human battalions to last long. Nobody expected them to matter much. The Varrox Dominion was the most organized destructive force the Coalition had encountered in 3 centuries, and humanity had been in space for fewer than 40 years. They had ships that the Coalition's own engineers quietly described as creative. They had tactics that the Coalition's strategists found difficult to classify. And they had volunteered for the worst assignment on the map. My job was to watch them fail gracefully and write something dignified about it afterward. That was the plan. Sergeant Major Cord Halverson found me before I found her. I had been standing near the edge of the landing pad with my travel case at my feet, trying to identify which of the dozens of humans moving around me was supposed to be my contact, when a hand appeared in my peripheral vision and pressed something rectangular and wrapped in foil against my chest. "Ration pack," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten." She did not ask if I wanted it. She did not ask my name. She looked at me the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed in a slightly inconvenient location and then immediately the furniture would be fine. Cord Halvorsen was not what I had pictured when I read the briefing file. The file had said commanding officer of the 14th Human Auxiliary, 12 years of service, multiple commendations. It had not said that she was built like something load-bearer, that her left forearm carried a scar from elbow to wrist that she wore with the total indifference of someone who has forgotten it is there, or that she would hand a foreign journalist a ration pack without ceremony, and then turn around and start walking, clearly expecting him to follow. I followed. I always follow sources. It is how I work. She walked me through the base in about 6 minutes, pointing at things the way a person points at things in their own home. The vehicle depot, the medical station, which was busier than I would have liked, the communications array, which was held together with what appeared to be wire and good intentions, the eastern wall, which had been rebuilt twice in the past week because the Varrox kept targeting it, and which the humans had started decorating with painted messages each time they put it back up. "You paint the wall?" I asked. "Keeps morale up," she said. "Is that a human custom, painting structures that are being actively targeted?" She looked at me sideways, not unkindly. It was more the look of someone who has been asked why they breathe. "Sure," she said. "I guess it is." I was given a space in what passed for the correspondence quarters, a narrow room with a cot, a shelf, and a small window that faced northwest, which meant I had a clear view of the horizon where the Varrox artillery lit the sky every few hours in quiet orange pulses. The human who showed me to the room, a young soldier named Pete Garner, told me not to worry about the flashes. He said they were far enough away tonight. "Tonight," I said. "Yeah," he said cheerfully. "Tonight." Pete Garner was 19 years old by human reckoning. He had a photograph taped to the inside of his helmet. He offered to share his coffee with me before I had a chance to tell him I did not know what coffee was. I accepted. It tasted like something had gone wrong with it, but the humans consumed it with such consistent reverence that I felt I owed it more consideration than my initial reaction suggested. I sat at the small shelf desk that night and began my first dispatch. I wrote, "The humans are louder than expected. Their equipment is improvised. Their base has been damaged multiple times and repaired with materials that Coalition engineers would not use for non-essential structures. The commanding officer is direct to the point of bluntness. The soldiers appear comfortable. This is the part I struggled with most. They appeared comfortable. Not resigned. Not performing calm for the benefit of observers. Genuinely, functionally at ease in a place that was by any objective measure, hostile." I filed the dispatch. I added, almost as an afterthought at the end, that I expected to be reporting their collapse within the week. I did not sleep well that first night. The artillery on the horizon was not close, but it was constant and I was not built for it. At some point in the early hours I heard laughter again from somewhere deeper in the base. It was not muffled. It was not trying to be quiet. 3 or 4 voices enjoying something at 2 in the morning, within range of the largest military force the galaxy had produced in modern history. I lay in my cot and listened to it for a long time. I could not decide if it was the bravest thing I had ever heard or the most bewildering. By the time the sky started to change color, I had decided it might be both. I learned what coffee actually does to a human being on the 3rd morning. Pete Garner had been awake for 27 hours when I found him running diagnostic checks on a communication relay, with the focused expression of someone doing pleasant and moderately engaging work, not frantic, not shaking, just steady, methodical, present. He had 2 empty cups next to him and was starting a 3rd one, and when I asked him when he had last slept, he looked at the ceiling for a moment as though trying to remember where he had put something. "Yesterday, maybe," he said. "Before the Eastern breach." "Are you well?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, and went back to the relay. I had covered wars. I knew what sleep deprivation looked like in most species. It looked like functional collapse, eyes that lost focus, coordination errors, judgment degradation. Pete Garner's hands were perfectly steady. His speech was clear. He found a fault in the relay's secondary routing at hour 28 and fixed it in 12 minutes. This was around the time I started keeping a second set of notes. Not the dispatches. Personal notes. Things I could not explain and did not yet know how to frame for a readership that had never been here. The first engagement I witnessed happened on day 4. I want to be careful about how I describe it, because I do not want the wrong things to stand out. The Varix Dominion sent a strike unit to probe the northern perimeter. Not a full assault. More of a question, the military equivalent of knocking on a wall to see what was behind it. The alert went through the base in about 30 seconds. I had been told by coalition military liaisons that I was an observer, and my position was non-combatant, which meant I was supposed to stay back. Stay low and stay out of the way. I stayed back, I stayed low, I watched. What happened over the next 40 minutes rearranged something in my understanding of the word organized. The humans moved through the trench systems and hard points along the northern wall with a kind of practiced chaos that should not have worked but did. There was no silence. There was constant communication, not just on the radio channels but in person, voices carrying across the smoke, short sentences, specific and fast, and there were decisions happening faster than I could track them. Not from the top down, from everywhere at once. Corporal Nina Diaz was in my line of sight for most of it. She was small for a human, which I later learned meant nothing whatsoever, and she moved through the trench with a speed that I genuinely had not expected from a species that was not known for particularly impressive physical capability and coalition records. Those records turned out to have been compiled without much first-hand observation, because Nina Diaz moved like something that had been designed specifically for this environment and had also, somehow, found the time to resent it while excelling at it. She took a hit. I saw it happen. A fragment from an energy burst caught her left side and she went down on one knee, and everything in my body told me that was the end of that particular human's contribution to this engagement. She stood back up, not slowly, not carefully. She pressed her free hand against her side, held it there for 2 seconds, said something to herself that I could not hear across the noise, and went back to her position. I did not know what to do with this information. I filed it under things I would need to ask about later. When the engagement ended and the Varix probe pulled back, the base did not celebrate. There were nods. There were short conversations. Someone made a joke I did not catch and 2 others laughed. The medic team moved through and attended to injuries with the brisk competence of people who had been doing this for a very long time. Private Kwame Osei was the medic who came to Nina Diaz. He was built large and moved gently, which was a combination I found striking, and he examined her side with focused efficiency, while carrying on a conversation with her about something entirely unrelated to what he was doing. She winced once. He made a note. He patched the wound with practiced hands and then said something to her quietly. She said something back that made him laugh. I approached him afterward. I asked how she was. He said she would be fine. I asked what he had said to make her laugh. He thought about it. I told her she was lucky it missed anything important. She said everything about her is important. I asked him how he became a medic. He looked at me with an expression that was not impatience but was close to it. The expression of someone who finds the question slightly beside the point. Someone has to, he said. And then he moved on to the next person. I stood there for a moment after he left. Someone has to. 3 words. In Savhari we would have said it differently. We would have said something that translated roughly to I was chosen for this role by circumstance and training. Kwame Ose said someone has to, which placed the reason not in his past but in the present situation. There was a need. He filled it. The explanation was the need itself. I wrote it down. Over the following days I learned things about humans that I had not found in any coalition briefing document. The documents spoke about their pain tolerance in the abstract, in terms of biological data and threshold comparisons. Being here was different. Their relationship with pain was not, and I want to be precise about this, the absence of pain response. They felt it. They responded to it. They said so out loud, frequently and with descriptive language. What they did not do was allow it to make decisions for them. I watched a soldier named Greg Fallon complete a 4-hour rotation on a watch position with a sprained knee because the relief shift had been delayed. He sat with his legs straight and his hands busy, and did not mention the knee once until someone noticed him standing awkwardly afterward and asked. When they asked, he said it was fine. When they pressed, he said it was sore but fine. When the medic looked at it and said it was actually not fine and wrapped it properly, Greg Fallon said, in all seriousness, that he had thought it was getting better. It is purple, the medic said. I know, Greg Fallon said, but purple's almost fine. I recorded this conversation, not because it was useful militarily, because I needed proof, for myself and eventually for whoever would read my notes, that this actually happened. That a human being said, without irony, that purple was almost fine. There was a quiet hour on the 5th evening when the artillery had paused, and the base had that particular quality of held breath that comes between things. I found Cord Halvorsen sitting on a crate near the eastern wall with a cup of coffee and no particular expression on her face. I sat near her because I had been learning that the best time to talk to people who did not have much interest in talking was when they had nowhere obvious to be. We sat for a while without speaking, then she said, "You're taking a lot of notes." "It is my job," I said. "What are you writing about?" "Everything," I said. And then because it was the evening and the sky was doing something complicated and I was tired, enough to be honest, I expected this to be different. "What did you expect?" I thought about it. "I expected you to seem more afraid." Cord Halvorsen looked at the eastern wall. Someone had painted, in large bright letters, a sentence I did not fully understand. I would ask Pete Garner about it later, and he would explain it was a phrase from a very old human story about going somewhere difficult and coming back. "Fear's useful," she said, "but you can't let it drive." She drank from her cup. "You let fear drive, you'll end up crashed somewhere before you got where you were going." I wrote that down too. I still did not have a word in Savhari for what I was watching. The closest thing in our language was fortitude. But fortitude implies effort, the conscious act of overcoming. What the humans at Forward Operating Base Aura were doing did not look like overcoming. It looked like living. As though the front line was simply where they happened to be right now, and they had brought with them everything that made them themselves. The laughter, the coffee, the photographs in the helmets, the jokes, the arguments about whose equipment was borrowed without asking. And they were going to keep being themselves here because where else would they be? The Varix Dominion did not understand this about them. I was beginning to think no one did. I sent my second dispatch that evening. It was shorter than the first. It said, "I may have misjudged the timeline." What I meant was, I may have misjudged everything. But I was not yet ready to put that in writing. I was not yet sure I had the words for it. And I was not yet sure, sitting there in the dim light of a base that should not still be standing, that I had understood enough to describe what I was seeing. But I was starting to think that whatever it was something the galaxy had not properly counted. On the 8th day, they lost 3. I had been at the base long enough by then to know names. Not just the officers. Not just the people who spoke to me directly. I knew the rotation schedules by sound. I could tell the change of watch by footsteps. I knew who took their coffee black, and who traded ration items with who. And I knew that the soldier named Derek Cole sang to himself while he worked. Quietly, tuneless songs that he made up as he went, about whatever he was doing at that moment. Checking the perimeter, he sang about the perimeter. Cleaning equipment, he sang about equipment. Derek Cole was one of the 3 they lost. I will not describe the engagement in detail. Not because it is difficult for me to write, but because the engagement is not the part that changed me. What changed me was what came after. The bass went quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Not silent, quiet differently. As though the noise was still there, but it had been moved to another room. People moved at the same pace, but with a different weight to it. I stood near the medical station and did not know where to put myself, and Pete Garner found me there and stood next to me, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then he said, "Did you know Derek?" He sang. Pete Garner nodded. He always sang. He was quiet for a moment. He sang in the shower so loud you could hear him 3/4 of the way across the base. Some people found it annoying. He paused. I didn't. I asked if he wanted to talk about him. He said yes, and then he did. For about 20 minutes. Stories that did not have neat endings. Just things Derek Cole had done and said and thought were funny. Offered up with no particular structure, except that they were true, and he wanted to say them out loud to someone. I listened. It seemed important to listen well. What I observed in the hours after that loss was something I had never encountered in a conflict zone before. In most species, grief produces one of two field responses. The first is suppression. Commanders encourage it because it maintains operational capacity. The second is genuine disruption, which reduces operational capacity but is at least internally consistent as a response to loss. The humans at Forward Operating Base Ura did neither of these things. They grieved openly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that halted anything. But tears were not hidden here, and the people who shed them were not treated as weaker for it. Cord Halverson sat with Nina Diaz for a while, and I could see from a distance that neither of them was trying to appear unmoved. Then Cord Halverson stood up, said something I could not hear, and by the afternoon she was in a briefing session planning the next operation. The same people who had been visibly grieving that morning were loading equipment by late afternoon. I asked Kwame Osei about this. He was the kind of person who gave careful answers. He thought for a long time before he said anything. Grief doesn't mean stop, he said. It means you carry it. You carry it and you keep going, and carrying it is actually how you respect what you lost, not by putting everything down. He let that settle. If you put everything down every time something went wrong, he said, you wouldn't make it to the next thing, and the next thing is the whole point. I asked him what the next thing was. He looked at me the way Cord Halverson looked at me sometimes, the way that was not impatience but was close to it. Surviving, he said simply, and then the thing after that. On the 10th day, the Varix Dominion sent a psychological broadcast. I had seen these used in other conflicts. They were effective tools. Every species has fear signatures, particular stimuli that produce disproportionate distress responses. The Dominion's intelligence division was skilled at identifying these and crafting broadcasts that hit them precisely. I knew of Karathi formations that had broken under a well-targeted broadcast within hours. The Ulvith Mercenary Corps had a documented vulnerability to certain sound frequencies that the Dominion had exploited twice. The broadcast reached the base at 0600. It was played through captured coalition frequencies. It was, by the technical standards I had seen applied to these things, very good. It was designed to trigger anticipatory fear, the sensation of inevitable loss, and it cycled through the signatures of multiple species in the coalition alliance. Cord Halverson listened to it for about 45 seconds. Then she called Pete Garner over, said something to him quietly, and pointed at the speaker system. He connected his personal audio device to it. The broadcast was replaced, bass-wide, by a human song. It was fast and loud, and I had no idea what it meant, and neither, I think, did the Varix Dominion's intelligence division, because this was not a thing they had anticipated. 3 soldiers near the eastern wall started moving to it. Not because they had been ordered to, just because the music was on. I sat down on a crate and looked at the horizon. The psychological broadcast had been designed using fear profiles. The humans did not appear to have the right fear profile. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that stayed with me, their fear profile was shaped differently, not the absence of fear. Fear shaped around the people next to them rather than the situation surrounding them. I did not know how to put this in a dispatch yet. I was still working it out. What I knew was that a species-level psychological attack tool had been deployed, and the response had been, essentially, to replace it with music and keep going. I wrote in my personal notes that night, the Varix Dominion is fighting a war on one map. The humans are fighting a war on a different map. I am not sure the 2 maps describe the same territory. I also wrote, I have stopped writing dispatches about when they will fall. And I wrote, smaller, at the bottom of the page, something I had been thinking, since the morning Pete Garner stood next to me and talked about Derek Cole's singing. I do not know what to call what I am watching. But I have been filing reports from conflict zones for 14 years, and I have never once felt the particular feeling I feel here, which is, against all evidence and against all prior expectation, Something I can only describe as safe, not physically safe. That would be incorrect, and the eastern wall, freshly painted for the third time, was proof enough of that. Something else, the feeling that the people around me were not going to leave each other. And that this, somehow, in some way I did not fully understand yet, made the difference. The Varrics Dominion did not give warnings before a siege. What they gave was silence. A particular quality of silence that I noticed only because Cord Halvorsen noticed it first. And I had learned to watch Cord Halvorsen, the way you watch a very experienced navigator watch the sky. She was in the center of the base at roughly 0400 when the outpost reports stopped coming in with their usual frequency. And she was still for a moment in a way I had only seen her be still once before, the night we sat by the eastern wall. Then she walked quickly to the communication station and started talking. I had my recorder running. I do not think she noticed. What followed was 45 minutes of controlled preparation. I want to say controlled chaos, but that would not be accurate. The chaos, if it could be called that, was controlled. Every person in that base knew what to do and moved toward doing it without being told twice, sometimes without being told once. They had practiced this, not just the physical movements but the decision-making. Who covered what, who went where, who took the harder position and who backed them up. Kwame Ose was setting up the medical station for surge capacity, which means he was preparing for the worst version of what was coming and doing it with the same steady fuga as he brought to everything. I asked him if there was anything I could do. He looked at me briefly. "Can you move fast?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Then stay close," he said. "And if I say go somewhere, go there." I agreed. I was aware this was not what coalition correspondent protocols dictated. I was also aware that the protocols had been written by people who had never been inside this particular base. The assault began before the sun was fully up. The scale of it was different from the probe on the fourth day. This was not a question. This was a statement. The Varrics Dominion came at the perimeter in coordinated waves, and the sound of it was something I do not have language for. Not loud in the simple sense, but loud in every direction at once, so that it stopped being background and became the entire environment. And the humans answered it. I stayed close to Kwame Ose for the first part of it, doing what he pointed me toward, carrying things, holding things, passing things. The work kept me from thinking about the noise. Every so often he said something brief and specific, and I understood that he was keeping me functional with the same pragmatic care he applied to everyone else, not comfort purpose. About 2 hours in, Nina Diaz came through the medical station with a gash across her right arm, and a completely different kind of energy than the last time I had seen her injured. She was moving fast and she was angry, not at anyone in particular, just the kind of anger that has nowhere to go and keeps you moving instead. "Same arm?" Kwame asked her. "Other arm," she said. "Progress," he said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated. He worked on her arm. She was back on her feet in 6 minutes. 6 hours after the assault began, I saw Cord Halvorsen for the first time since it started. She was on the northern wall where the pressure was heaviest, and she was, I need to describe this carefully, doing what she had always been doing, which was being the person in the center of a situation that could collapse on any axis and holding it together, not by shouting but by being present. She was there, visibly, physically there, making decisions and communicating them and listening to what came back, and the people around her were steadier for it. She had been hit. I could see it. The way she held herself was different on the left side. She had not gone to the medical station. I did not have time to think about this because at that moment Kwame said my name and pointed at a direction, and I moved. 9 hours in, I was carrying supplies from a storage point to the medical station when the route I had been using became unavailable. I will not describe why. I found a different route. In doing so, I passed a position where 2 soldiers I did not know by name were holding a doorway, and they looked at me as I went past, and one of them said, completely calmly, "Hey, you all right?" I was covered in supply dust and I had been running for 9 hours, and the answer was not clearly yes. But I said yes, because the alternative seemed rude, and they nodded and went back to what they were doing. This is the moment I stopped being an observer. I did not make a decision about it. It simply happened. I had been outside the war, watching it, recording it, filing reports about it, and then I was inside it, passing 2 soldiers who asked if I was all right, and there was no clean line between the 2 states. At hour 11, the relief came. The coalition's rapid response unit arrived from the eastern approach, and the Varric siege pulled back in the measured, unhurried way of an enemy that has not fully committed and does not need to. They would be back. Everyone in the base knew they would be back, but they were not back right now. The base, for the first time since before dawn, was quiet in the ordinary sense. I sat down on the ground near the medical station because my legs made the decision before I did. Kwame Osi sat down near me. He was not injured. He was simply at the end of something large. We sat there for a while. You did well, he said. I did not know what to say to this. I had carried boxes. I had moved quickly when told to. I had not, in any meaningful military sense, contributed to the survival of the base. I followed instructions, I said. That's usually enough, she said. Cord Halverson appeared at the medical station eventually, walking in the deliberate way of someone who has been ignoring something for long enough that they can afford to address it now. The wound in her left side was, in fact, not fine, which Kwame told her in the tone of someone who has said this type of thing many times before to this type of person. She sat down and let him look at it. While he worked, she looked at me. What are you still doing here? She said, not unkindly. Genuinely curious. I had nowhere to go, I said, which was the truth in several different senses. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, Veth Karn, that's your name, right? Yes, I said. Well, she said, you stayed. That counts for something. I did not know at the time that I would remember those words for the rest of my life. I did not know that they would become the thing I would come back to on the bad nights. Later, when I was back home and the base was a memory and the war was in someone else's dispatches, I did not know that a sentence that simple could carry that much weight. But that is the thing about humans, I was learning. They had a way of saying things that were exactly the right size for what they needed to say. Not too large, not too careful, just right. And then they moved on to the next thing. I moved on too, eventually. But that comes later. What I knew in that hour, sitting outside the medical station on the ground, was that I had been sent here to observe a species in decline, to document a brave, doomed effort by a young and unprepared people who had volunteered for something they did not fully understand. And what I had found instead was something that I was still working out how to describe. Not invincibility, not the absence of loss, not fearlessness. Something more honest than all of those. Something that did not have a clean translation in my language. People who did not leave each other. People who grieved and kept going. People who fixed the wall and painted something on it. People who asked if you were all right when they had 11 other things to be doing. People who understood, at some level that was below thought and below training and below strategy, that the person next to you was the reason you kept going, and that keeping them going was the reason you were here, and that this specific thing, this mutual and stubborn and loud and coffee-fueled refusal to let each other fall, was what the word together actually meant when you used it in a place like this. The Varrics Dominion had superior numbers, they had superior technology, they had strategic advantages that any analyst would confirm on paper. They did not have this. I was not certain yet that this would be enough. The war was long and the Dominion was patient, and the base had been hit hard today. But sitting in the dust outside the medical station while Kwame Ose worked quietly and the base began, slowly, to reassemble itself around me, I found that my certainty about what was enough and what was not had become much less reliable than it used to be. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was glad to be wrong. I came home on a coalition transport 3 weeks later, not because I was ordered home, not because anything had happened to drive me out. I left because my editor had sent 7 messages and the last one had used punctuation in a way that made clear she was concerned, and I owed her the courtesy of appearing alive in person. The transport was clean, and the seats were designed for Savari physiology, and the temperature was correctly calibrated, and no one was playing music at 4 in the morning. It was comfortable in every way that mattered technically, and it felt completely wrong in every way that didn't. I had a window seat. I watched the planet get smaller. Somewhere below me the base was still there. The eastern wall had been painted for the 4th time the morning I left. Pete Garner had done most of it, and he had added something new, a phrase I recognized from a very old human story about going somewhere and coming back. He had painted it in letters large enough to read from a significant distance, and he had used yellow, which he told me was his favorite color for things that needed to be noticed. Why yellow? I had asked. Harder to ignore than blue, he said. Blue's pretty, but it blends in. Yellow just sits there and says, here I am. I had laughed at that. It had surprised me, the laugh. I had been surprised by how naturally it came, standing there in the early morning with the smell of paint and coffee and burned earth that I had grown so used to I no longer noticed it until I thought about leaving. Cord Halverson had said goodbye without ceremony, which was consistent with how she had said hello. She was standing near the vehicle depot with her arms crossed and a cup of coffee, and she said, "Travel safe, Veth," the way you say it to someone you expect to see again. I did not know at the time whether she meant it that way. I thought about it for most of the transport ride. The Savari Interplanetary Dispatch welcomed me back with a press event. My editor, a methodical woman named Hau Vess who had known me for 9 years, met me at the landing bay with the look she reserved for things she was relieved about but was not going to say. "You look different," she said. "I've been somewhere different," I said. "We need the report by end of week," she said. "Something compelling. The readership wants the human front story. You know the angle they want." The angle was brave sacrifice, inevitable decline, nobility of spirit in the face of impossible odds. It was a good story. It was a story that people would read and feel moved by, and then feel confirmed in what they already believed, which was that the humans were admirable and probably doomed. I went home, I sat at my desk, I opened my notes. There were, by that point, a very large number of notes, not just the dispatches, the personal record, the conversations I had written down not because I needed them for the report, but because I needed them for myself. Pete Garner talking about Derek Cole's singing. Nina Diaz saying that everything about her was important. Kwame Osei saying someone has to, as though the sentence were complete in every way it needed to be. Cord Halvorsen saying you let fear drive and you'll end up crashed somewhere before you got where you were going. I sat at my desk for a long time. Then I started writing the report I actually needed to write, which was not the one they had asked for. It did not catalog battlefield strategy. It did not assess the human auxiliary's tactical value to the coalition effort in numerical terms. It did not tell the story of brave and doomed young soldiers meeting their fate with courage. What it did was try imperfectly, in a language that did not have all the words I needed, to describe what I had actually seen. I wrote about laughter near an active front. I wrote about purple being almost fine. I wrote about a wall that had been rebuilt 4 times and painted every time it came back up. I wrote about grief that did not mean stop. I wrote about a medic who answered a question about why he chose his work with 3 words that contained their own complete philosophy. I wrote about a woman who handed a stranger a ration pack without asking because he looked like he hadn't eaten, and who said fear was useful but you couldn't let it drive, and who held a position for 11 hours with a wound in her side because the alternative was unthinkable. I wrote about what it meant to be asked if you were all right by someone who had 11 other things to do. The report was published. It caused considerable discussion. Some reviewers called it sentimental. One prominent coalition commentator wrote that I had lost my journalistic perspective after spending too long in close proximity to my subjects, which was a criticism I understood and did not find entirely unfair but also did not find particularly compelling, because the close proximity was exactly how I had learned anything worth knowing. Several species found the report alarming, not because it described violence, it contained very little of that, but because of what it implied, that humans were not, as commonly assumed, fighting despite their nature. They were fighting through it, with it, because of it. That the things which made them effective in that environment were not separate from the things that made them human. The grief and the laughter, and the coffee and the songs, and the photographs in the helmets. These were not side effects of being human at war. They were the mechanism. A Karathi military analyst wrote a response piece that included the line, "If this report is accurate, the Varrics Dominion is in more trouble than current projections suggest." The analyst was more right than he knew. 3 months after my report was published, I received a package. It had been routed through 3 courier systems, and the external label had been done by hand in the large, practical handwriting of someone who was not trying to be neat, just clear. Inside was a photograph. It was Phobe Aura, the eastern wall, recently painted, yellow letters catching the morning light. Pete Garner's work, I was sure of it. On the back, in different handwriting, smaller, more deliberate, "You stayed" counts. Cord Halvorsen. No other message, no explanation. The sentence was the whole thing, and it was exactly the right size. I held the photograph for a long time. Then I picked up my correspondence and wrote to the Coalition's Joint Liaison Office. I told them I wanted to register as a field liaison to the Human Auxiliary Battalions, not as a journalist, not as an observer, as someone who had been there and knew the work and could bridge the particular gap that existed between the humans and the species that kept trying to read them through the wrong set of expectations. The intake officer asked me to explain my qualifications. I told him I had spent 6 weeks at Forward Operating Base Ura. I told him I had carried medical supplies for 11 hours during a siege. I told him I had learned, over the course of that time, that the most important thing about the humans was not their physical capability, or their tactical creativity, or their pain tolerance, though all of those were real and significant. The most important thing was simpler. They did not leave each other. In a war that had been breaking everything else for a decade, the humans had decided, somehow, at some level that was beyond training and strategy and doctrine, that the person next to you was not a resource to be managed or a unit to be assigned. The person next to you was the reason, and you stayed or you kept going or you got back up, not for abstract ideals but for that specific face, that specific voice, that specific someone who was counting on you to still be there in the next hour. This was not in any coalition military manual. It was not a documented tactical doctrine. but I had watched it work for 6 weeks, against a force that should have been able to break everything it touched. The intake officer asked me why I wanted to do this work when I had a successful career in journalism. I thought about Kwame Ose. I thought about the way he said it, flat and simple and complete. Someone has to, I said. The intake officer wrote something down. He looked up at me. Welcome aboard, he said. I was assigned to the 14th Human Auxiliary, the same unit, the same base, reconstituted now in a new forward position further into contested space. Pete Garner was still there. Nina Diaz was still there. Kwame Ose was still there. Cord Halvorsen was still there when I arrived. She was standing near the vehicle depot, with her arms crossed and a cup of coffee. She looked at me with the expression she had used the first day, the one that placed me in the category of furniture in a slightly inconvenient location, except that now it was warmer, the way furniture can be warmer once you have lived with it long enough to know where it belongs. You came back, she said. Yes, I said. Told you it would count, she said, and turned back to what she was doing. I picked up my case. I found my quarters. I looked out the window at the horizon, which was doing that thing again. The quiet orange light of artillery, far enough away to be background but close enough to mean something. I did not feel afraid. I felt, against all prior evidence about what a conflict zone should feel like, something that I had spent the whole journey back trying to find the right word for. I felt like I was where I was supposed to be. Outside, someone was laughing. It was Pete Garner. I knew his laugh by now. And underneath it, barely audible, was the sound of someone singing to themselves, tuneless and low, about whatever they happened to be doing. I did not recognize the voice. The singer was new. There was always someone new. But they were singing, and the bass was still standing, and the eastern wall had a fresh coat of paint on it, and people were going about the business of being here. Fully, loudly, stubbornly, completely here, in the way that I had learned, slowly and then all at once, was the only real answer to everything the dark kept sending toward them. I sat down on my cot and put the photograph of the wall on the shelf where I could see it. Then I picked up my notebook. I wrote, I survived the human war front. I wrote, it was worse than hell, in the specific sense that hell is a place where nothing means anything, and the human war front was a place where everything meant everything. Every name, every cup of coffee, every repaired wall, every hand pressed against a wound to keep going, every moment of grief that turned, without ceremony, into the next moment of action. I wrote, I came to document a species at the edge of what they could survive. I came thinking I would watch them fall. I wrote, I was wrong about almost everything. And I mean that in the best way I have ever been wrong about anything in my life. I wrote, they did not leave each other. I wrote, neither did I. I put the notebook down. I looked at the photograph. I listened to the bass outside my window, the machinery, the voices, the coffee cups, the song from someone new who was already, without knowing it, becoming part of what this place was. And I thought, whatever comes next, someone has to be here for it. I was glad that someone was me.